Now the 9 o'clock news with Michael Buerk.
Police fear that several children may have been murdered for pornographic videos. They're looking for 20 missing boys and say they're closing in on the paedophile rings that may have killed them. As the murdered nun is buried, the Pope calls for an end to the violence in Ulster. And Graham Gooch makes the highest test score for 30 years. Good evening. The Home Secretary says he's absolutely horrified by reports that several young boys may have been killed during the filming of pornographic videos. A special team of detectives have been working for a year on the cases of 20 missing boys. They believe as many as 9 may have been murdered by paedophile groups who filmed them as they died.
In their search for the bodies of missing boys, police have already dug up this car park at Clapton in East London. They'd been told by a convicted child abuser that a number of youngsters had been murdered by paedophile groups and buried at various places around the capital. At this site they found only animal bones, but they think human remains may have been inadvertently removed by builders. The investigation is being linked to the death of Jason Swift, a 14-year-old boy killed by paedophiles at a flat only a mile from the Clapton search. It's believed his death was recorded by a video camera. 4 men are now serving long sentences for his manslaughter. The police officer leading the investigation won't comment on reports that the deaths of a number of boys were filmed. But he says he believes 2 paedophile groups, one in East London, the other in Kent, have been responsible for several killings.
My information at this moment is that 9 boys have been murdered or killed in the process of sexual abuse. But there may be others.
After hearing today's revelations, the Home Secretary said he was so concerned that he would be closely following the police investigation.
The stories are horrific, absolutely horrific, and I know that the police are wasting no time to make all the inquiries that they can and are attaching a great importance to their investigation.
In recent months, large quantities of child pornography have been seized, evidence of a growing trade among paedophiles in which videos can change hands for hundreds of pounds. Detectives are now thought to be studying the files on about 20 boys who've gone missing and say they're anxious to hear from anyone who's been involved in the making of such films or subjected to sexual abuse by paedophile groups.
And the police have set up a confidential phone line for people with information. It's 071, that's the code for Inner London, 488 6570. That's 071 488 6570. Police and welfare groups say increasing numbers of children are suffering horrific abuse at the hands of pornographers.
It's some of society's most vulnerable people, like those living rough in inner cities or very young children who are often the victims of organised sexual abuse involving pornography. But lack of evidence, victims' age and their fears of speaking out, coupled with scarce police resources, have meant that few cases have come to court.
The police who are dealing with the vice industry and the sort of paedophile rings we've been hearing about are terribly under-resourced, and would like to see them have more support for their work.
As police forces around the country seize an ever-increasing amount of child pornography, in some areas like Birmingham, special teams have been set up to tackle the problem. Here there's been a 4-fold increase in cases since 1986. Most of the material is produced by small groups of paedophiles.
Paedophiles you generally find work in small syndicates, small groups, and yes, to satisfy their own needs, because it's not easy to get this type of material commercially. I'm sure that they do abuse young children and pass it on within their own circles.
No one yet knows how widespread sexual abuse involving pornography is in Britain, but organisations like the NSPCC have no doubt that it involves an increasing number of children. Jim Harding, director of the NSPCC's childcare division, says it's crucial that the extent of the problem is now recognised, so that children can be encouraged to speak out before more damage is done.
I think anyone that's has fond feelings for children and the way they should be treated will find this difficult to understand and to believe. But it does happen, and what we mustn't allow on the one hand is to exaggerate it, say that all children are being abused on one hand, but on the other hand we mustn't be complacent and try and push it under the carpet.
There's no agreement over how paedophiles should be treated, but the options are limited. There's only one open prison where a small number of offenders can go. Otherwise, they're sent to prisons like Winchester and segregated. A solution many believe simply makes the problem worse.
I think when people are starting to kill and destroy, then the whole concept of life sentencing has to be looked at, and maybe life will mean life for many of these people. The reality is that most of those men that I had worked with in prison had other offences of a lesser nature. The tragedy was nothing was done when they were committing those offences.
But whatever the solution, there's little doubt that organised sex rings are on the increase. Those involved in counselling the children believe they may never recover from their experience.
OPEC ministers meeting in Geneva have agreed to put up the price they want for their oil from $18 to $21 a barrel. They've also decided on new production limits to restrict supply. Petrol prices are likely to go up as a result, but how much will depend on whether all the OPEC members stick to their agreement.
The battle of words over, OPEC oil ministers gathered in Geneva to announce a new target price for oil of $21 a barrel. It's more than Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates had wanted, but Iraqi military threats forced them into compromise.
I was looking really for $20, but for the sake of the unity of OPEC and the compromise, we've gone along with $21.
Kuwait and the other Gulf states wanted to keep oil prices low to protect OPEC's share of world markets. But war-ravaged Iraq needs every penny it can get to rebuild its shattered economy, and was even prepared to threaten an invasion of Kuwait to force OPEC's agreement to higher prices. On the world markets, the price of oil has been rising sharply for weeks. Britain's motorists are already feeling the impact. Petrol companies are often quicker to raise prices when the cost of oil goes up than to cut them when the oil price falls. Petrol has just gone up by around 5 pence a gallon. This afternoon's agreement means those changes may not be the last.
Over the next few months, they will need to buy more oil to keep the customer satisfied. They're going to have to buy it in the open market, and the open market prices are very likely to reflect the new OPEC agreement.
To achieve its new target price, the OPEC nations will have to cut their oil production and create a world shortage. But while Iraq's military threats may force its OPEC partners to reduce output for a time, threats can't be maintained forever. And many doubt whether OPEC's new target price can be sustained much beyond the year's end.
The Pope has sent a special message to the funeral of Sister Catherine Dunn, the first nun to die in the 20-year campaign of violence in Northern Ireland. He called for an end to terrorism, which he said was unjust and futile. Sister Catherine and 3 policemen were killed by an IRA bomb in Armagh on Tuesday. Today she and one of the officers, David Sterritt, were buried. The RUC say 3 men are now being questioned about the murders.
There was still a sense of disbelief in Middletown today that a nun could be murdered in Northern Ireland's troubles. Hundreds of people walked in the rain from the St. Louis convent where Sister Catherine Dunn lived and worked to St. John's Parish Church a mile and a half away. Sister Catherine and her family are from Dublin, but it was decided she be laid to rest here because her religious sisters are her new family. Colin McCann, the husband of the social worker injured in the bomb blast, joined the mourners at the Requiem Mass. The chief celebrant said the death had brought the whole community together.
Politicians are in some way responding to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and one would hope that they and all who have positions of influence over events would wholeheartedly take part in the process of talks, and that they would lay aside any kind of tribal posturings.
And indeed, politicians from all sides were present, including the Ulster Unionist MP Ken McGuinness. The Pope's message calling on those involved in violence to stop was read to the congregation. After the service, Sister Catherine was buried in a small cemetery beside her convent. The funeral of one of the 3 policemen killed in Tuesday's outrage also took place today. Reserve Constable David Sterrett was buried in Market Hill after a service at the local Presbyterian church. The RUC Chief Constable Hugh Ansley walked behind the coffin, and again politicians from both sides of Ulster's divide were there. Speaking at the service, Dr. Tom Simpson, the General Secretary of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, was bitterly critical of recent problems over extradition from the Irish Republic. Technicalities which he said must not allow guilty persons to evade their just deserts.
The IRA say they killed a man whose body was found by the roadside last night in South Armagh. 30-year-old Patrick Flood had been shot in the head. His body was found just outside the village of Newton Hamilton. The IRA say he was one of their members who had been passing on information to the security forces. The South African government has asked the ANC to drop the white communist leader Joe Slovo from its delegation negotiating political reforms. There have been allegations of a communist plot to overthrow the government if the negotiations fail. The ANC says it's considering the request but insists that no such plot exists. The South African police have already arrested several leading members of the Communist Party and the ANC and say more arrests could follow.
Nelson Mandela briefly escaped the dilemma in which the ANC has been placed by President de Klerk's demand to attend a belated birthday party thrown for him by children in Soweto. But even here, he didn't miss the opportunity to suggest once again that the authorities were manufacturing the story of an insurrection plot.
You stand by your position of the other day that there is no plot by Communist Party members.
Oh, yes, well, there is no plot.
It emerged today that Mr. Mandela left his meeting with President de Klerk last night under pressure to exclude the Communist Party leader Joe Slovo from the next round of talks with the government.
Here at ANC headquarters, Mr. Mandela has been in private discussion with his colleagues on what's now undoubtedly the biggest crisis to face the ANC and the Communist Party since they were unbanned and began talks about talks with the government. It's a crisis that clearly could jeopardize this delicate process, though both sides seem to be equally anxious that this shouldn't happen.
The security establishment insists they have evidence of a separate communist agenda, as the Commissioner of Police told South African television viewers.
The detentions and actions of the police are based on reliable evidence and rest on firm legal grounds. We are in possession of a large quantity of documents and various other exhibits.
The arrest of Mak Makaraj, a close Communist Party colleague of Mr. Slovo's, put the alleged plot on a new plane. Ronnie Casreels, who's also engaged in strengthening underground structures, defends the work he's been doing.
The South African government, police, the South African military are building up their forces. Umkhonto weSizwe, the ANC's military wing, has the right to recruit, to train, to build up its forces.
The authorities say there are likely to be more people arrested. Mr. Casreels expects to be among them.
East Germany's Social Democrats have agreed to stay in the country's ruling coalition, ending 10 days of political crisis. The Social Democrats had been threatening to walk out in a row over the timing of political union with West Germany. It's now been agreed that Germany should become one country just before elections in December. But the coalition partners still can't agree about exactly how the election should be organised. American health officials are investigating a case in which a woman was apparently infected with the AIDS virus during dental treatment. They believe she was infected when she had 2 teeth removed by a dentist who was HIV positive. But the American Dental Association said the findings in the case were not conclusive.
The risk of patients contracting the AIDS virus from health workers is thought to be slight, but new American guidelines are being considered and there are fears some patients may panic.
If this information is conveyed to the public in the wrong manner, it can create massive hysteria and lead patients to avoid certain professionals because of the feeling that they may be gay or have other risk factors for HIV.
After the unnamed young woman had 2 teeth pulled by a dentist infected with the AIDS virus, she developed AIDS-related pneumonia and proved positive on the HIV test. Molecular studies showed her infection was almost identical to that of her dentist. America's Centers for Disease Control ruled out other risk factors like drug abuse or sexual transmission.
Our best guess is that perhaps he stuck himself with a needle and then stuck the patient, or perhaps there was an instrument that was not properly decontaminated that passed the virus on from him to the patient.
Dentists routinely wear gloves and masks to protect themselves from patients' blood, but the implications of this case for HIV-positive health workers could be enormous.
It may mean that certain doctors and dentists will not be able to practice or will only practice in a very restricted way.
The Centers for Disease Control spent months investigating this case, and they always err on the side of caution. While they cannot prove conclusively how the young woman contracted the AIDS virus, they believe the evidence is sufficient to warrant a full-scale review of all relevant medical guidelines. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
The British Dental Association says there have been no cases in Britain of a patient or a dentist being infected with the HIV virus through dental treatment. And they say that if procedures designed to avoid infection are followed, there should be no risk of serious infectious diseases being transmitted during dental treatment. Lawyers representing the Guildford Four have called for an apology from the senior Old Bailey judge who said the Court of Appeal was mad to free them. Sir James Miskin, who's just retired after 15 years as Recorder of London, told the BBC there was a risk the IRA could have bribed a policeman to falsify documents in the case. But tonight, Sir James is reported to have told lawyers for the Guildford Four he hadn't meant to imply that they were guilty.
Inside the Old Bailey, Sir James Miskin spent his last day on the bench hearing an incest case. He refused all requests for interviews and let it be known that he would not be making any further comment. In his interview last night, Sir James said the decision to free the Guildford Four was mad.
They didn't give any thought to the fact that 3 years after it had happened, there was a full appeal, and there was no suggestion from any source that police documentation showed that the confessions had been cooked up.
Today, the Police Federation's chairman, Alan Eastwood, called the comments about the risk of the IRA having bribed a police officer an hysterical attempt at character assassination. Gareth Pearce, the solicitor for Gerard Conlon, one of the Guildford Four, said the judge's comments were those of an ill-informed and wrong-headed person. She said the remarks brought the judiciary into disrepute, as well as himself. And the barrister who represented another of the Guildford Four said Sir James's comments were deeply offensive.
These remarks are inconsistent with a rational reading of the Court of Appeal's judgment. The judge, if he leaves the innuendo that appears on the record at the moment, may find himself in considerable difficulties.
Sir James has now bowed out of the legal world into retirement. But it emerged this evening that before leaving, he telephoned the solicitor, Gareth Pearce, and told her that he had not intended to suggest that the Guildford Four were guilty. He has not, however, made any public comment.
Lawyers acting for the Queen have obtained an injunction in the High Court preventing publication of a book written by a former member of the royal household. The book, by Malcolm Barker, contains revelations about life in Buckingham Palace during the 3 years that he served there. The author's lawyers were told that he'd breached an undertaking given by all palace staff not to reveal details about their work. The injunction bans publication of his book anywhere in the world. However, his solicitors say the order is a denial of freedom of speech and they'll be appealing. The High Court has awarded record damages of more than £1.5 million to a former airline pilot who was paralysed in a motorcycle accident. 42-year-old John Lambert from Dorset suffered spinal injuries in the accident in Devon 9 years ago. The damages were awarded against Devon County Council.
Before the accident, John Lambert was an active young man, an experienced international pilot who was keen on skiing and mountaineering. His injuries left him virtually paralysed from the neck down and confined to a wheelchair for life. The accident happened 9 years ago on this stretch of country road in Devon. At the time, there was no barrier nor any warning to stop his motorcycle crashing through the bend. although in the High Court, the council was actually held liable because they failed to produce documents on time supporting their case in court that the road was in fact safe. Mr. Lambert says he'll spend the £1.5 million on the professional help and special housing he needs to maintain his independence now that his life has been changed forever.
Disability should never be viewed as a devastation. It's merely a drastic change in direction. One must not look upon disabled people with sympathy. They're their own people in their own rights, and every right to live a normal life.
And tonight he says he'll be celebrating the award with a special dinner at home in Dorset with his parents.
President Fidel Castro has challenged the West to issue entry visas to any Cuban wanting to emigrate. His surprise proposal follows international calls for him to allow several Cubans sheltering in foreign embassies to leave the island. In response, the president invited the West to send the boats, but he made it clear the offer didn't extend to those already taking refuge.
Fidel Castro faced his people on the 37th anniversary of the revolution with the country in a sorry state. Resisting reform, isolated from his former communist allies in Eastern Europe, he blamed his troubles on the United States. President Bush, he said, had a sick obsession with Cuba and was leading a campaign against it. The Cuban economy is in a dire state. There are food shortages and queues in what should be a well-fed island. The Soviet Union can ill afford to continue its subsidies, and now Cuba's become involved in a row with Spain, its biggest non-communist creditor. The argument is over Cubans who want to flee the country. The Spanish embassy's been sealed off since 18 Cubans took refuge there. Castro's angry with the Spanish ambassador for sheltering them and has told Madrid it can keep its economic aid. And during a 3-hour speech, modest by his standards, President Castro said anyone who wants to leave Cuba can go. And he dramatically challenged the United States, send the boats to collect them. In the emotional atmosphere of the anniversary, it's not clear if he intends a repetition of the mass exodus of 1980. Then, more than 100,000 people left the island, with Cuba taking the opportunity to deport both common criminals and political opponents. Absorbing them gave America a headache which lingered for years. But if Castro does it again, it will reduce both the economic and political pressures on him at home.
Bielorussia has become the latest Soviet republic to declare itself a sovereign state, giving its laws priority over those passed in Moscow. The republic's parliament voted unanimously in favor of the move. More than half of the 15 Soviet republics have now passed declarations demanding varying degrees of independence. Here, the former Guinness chairman, Ernest Saunders, thinks he's been a victim of an establishment conspiracy, Southwark Crown Court was told today. In his closing speech to the jury, Mr. Saunders' counsel said his client was now obsessed about clearing his name. Mr. Saunders and 3 other men faced charges of fraud and theft arising from the Guinness takeover of distillers in 1986.
Ernest Saunders has devoted the last 3.5 years to clearing his name, his counsel said today. The former Guinness chairman, accompanied to court by his son and daughter, is obsessed by an overpowering feeling of injustice and may well have become paranoid. Richard Ferguson QC, in his closing speech, told the court that all Mr. Saunders was looking for was a fair crack at the whip. Mr. Ferguson said Mr. Saunders had rescued Guinness and had been the company's hatchet man. But after the Guinness takeover of distillers in 1986, there'd been a search for a villain. Mr. Saunders was churned through the system, which had spewed him out, a broken and embittered man. Mr. Ferguson said any suggestion that Mr. Saunders and his co-defendants had made their money, now let them pay for it, should be resisted. Nor should it be thought there was one law for the rich and one for the poor. Olivier Roux, the former Guinness finance director and the central witness against Mr. Saunders earlier in the trial, was dismissed by Mr. Ferguson as a self-confessed liar. Mr. Roux had told the court Mr. Saunders had approved all the arrangements in the allegedly illegal share support operation. The case against the former Guinness chairman depended on Mr. Roux, counsel claimed. How, he asked, could Mr. Saunders be convicted when the credibility of the main witness against him had been buried? The trial continues next week.
Cricket, and the England captain Graham Gooch made the 6th highest individual score in Test history on the second day of the first Test against India at Lord's. Gooch made 333 out of an England total of 653 for 4 declared. By the close, India had made 48 without loss in reply.
Settling in for another day at the crease, Graham Gooch duly picked up the 6 runs he needed to reach his maiden 200 in Test cricket. It was the first of the day's several milestones. That landmark achieved, Gooch wasted no time in starting out on his 3rd 100 with a repetition of yesterday's sparkling stroke play. For England's next man in, it had become a test of patience. But Robin Smith didn't have too long to wait. As Alan Lamb's innings ended, the victim of a superb catch by Mandraker off Sharma, out for 139. Smith quickly showed he too had an appetite for runs as the onslaught continued and more records fell. A single took Gooch past Sir Donald Bradman's 254, until now the highest individual Test score at Lord's. 299 not out at tea, Gooch reached his triple century with the first ball after the interval. In doing so, he became only the 5th English batsman to pass 300 in a Test match and the first for 25 years. Attention now turned to the world record of 365. It seemed only a matter of time before he'd reach that milestone as well. But then, nearly 2 days at the crease finally took their toll. The England captain bowled by Prabhakar for 333. One of the most memorable innings in Test history had ended. It only remained for Robin Smith to complete his century, his 100th run considerably less elegant than many of the previous 99. But it was enough for Gooch to declare on 653 for 4. India made a brave start in the face of such a daunting total. By the close, they'd made 48 without loss, still 405 runs short of avoiding the follow-on.
And tonight's main news again. Police fear that several children may have been murdered for pornographic videos. The Home Secretary has said he's absolutely horrified by the reports. And the Pope has called for an end to terrorism in Ulster in a special message to the funeral of a nun murdered by the IRA. More on Newsnight on BBC2 at 10:30, but that's the 9 o'clock news tonight. Good night, have a good weekend.
This is the BBC for the Eastern Counties. Now the regional news with Louise Priest.
Good evening. Essex campaigner Mary Whitehouse has called for new obscenity laws after reports that young boys have been murdered filming snuff movies. She says distaste must lead to action to reduce child pornography.
When it comes to children like this, some of them as young as 3 and 4, we all owe it to the children that we do get proper legislation on the statute book.
A police officer has been fined £150 and banned from owning a pet for 2 years after pleading guilty to causing unnecessary suffering to his dog. Stephen Daly from Ardley near Colchester took his thin and underweight spaniel to a kennels after reporting it as a stray. The dog was under half the weight it should have been. An inquest has heard how the managing director of an aviation company died when his aerobatic plane crashed. The accident happened in February when the plane flown by Alan Chapman crashed at Pleshy near Chelmsford shortly after carrying out a number of aerobatic manoeuvres, including looping the loop. No mechanical cause was found for the crash, and the jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Firemen have rescued 2 bank employees at a Norwich branch of the TSB this evening after they locked themselves in the safe. It took firemen an hour to reach the keys and release the women.
When we opened the door, they were relieved, and the first words was they said thank you.
Had they had enough air?
Yes, we were supplying them readily with breathing apparatus, air from our breathing apparatus cylinders.
How did they raise the alarm?
I think the manager raised the alarm.
Divisional Officer Keith Webster talking to Stuart White. Well, that's all from us for tonight. A very good night.
Good evening. Well, it should be a full day's play at the Test match at Lord's tomorrow. Good news there. There were a couple of minor interruptions today, but not really amounting to very much. But that was surprising considering all the clouds streaming across the country, extending back through northeast France into the Bay of Biscay and northern Spain. There were some thunderstorms mixed up in that mass of cloud, and still some thunder now being reported off the southeastern coast of England, off Kent there. But most of the heavier rain's up in the north. It's going across northern England, southern Scotland and just clearing Northern Ireland at the present time. So still the odd crack of thunder likely tonight as it moves further north, not actually getting into the Shetlands until tomorrow though. Now all the time there's the chance of the odd spot of rain returning to Kent as we go through the night, where it will stay quite humid incidentally, but just 1 or 2 showers scattered around further west. Still quite a warm night really, 13 or 14 degrees, the mid-50s Fahrenheit, but turning rather misty I would fancy, around about the end of the night, first thing tomorrow morning. Now that mist will soon clear away tomorrow, and we're between 2 weather bands, that first band of rain going through the Northern Isles in the afternoon, but this next rather sinister looking thing coming up into the west tomorrow night and bringing rain into many western parts as we run through the weekend. But to start the day tomorrow, it'll be cloudy up in the north with some fairly heavy rain still around, and still a chance of the odd spot of rain down in the extreme southeast of England too. But elsewhere it'll be a bright start. There'll be bags of sunshine around, but there will be 1 or 2 showers out here in the west first thing, and rather more showers developing down the western side of the country as we run through into the afternoon. But for many central and eastern parts it looks like being a smashing day. Fair amount of sunshine around and quite warm too. Temperatures generally in the west about 20, and that's not too bad. About 24, 25 degrees on the eastern side, anywhere down through Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and into the southeast of England. So more pleasant than it was today, less oppressive, less sticky, less muggy. Now the high pressure will still be around in the southeast of England during Sunday, so I think amounts of rain down there are going to be pretty small, to say the least. It'll be another warm day in the southeastern corner, about 25 once again. But there will be quite a bit of rain turning up in these western areas first thing in the morning. That rain spreading across into central parts, maybe eastern parts of Scotland, northeast England during the day, with brighter, fresher weather returning later on. But it will be windy out in the northwest, and that's it.